Hello, everybody. My name is Christy. I'm Director of Women and Gender in International Development here at CRED, the Center for International Research, Education, and Development, as you can check. Shreya Satay is my graduate assistant, supporting the discussion series. She's from the grad student at the School of Engineering. So this is our final event of actually the whole academic year. So I'm going to try to skip some of these things, but I do want to say that we're really happy that we could get Becky Williams to join us. And I'll say more about her later. Also want to apologize that we scheduled this accidentally to overlap with Eid and most important Muslim holiday, and we did not mean to do that, and we will make sure that doesn't happen again. I do wish a happy Eid to all of those who celebrate. So as of this morning, we had 44 people registered, and I'm going to announce it from many different countries, many different organizations, universities, etc. I have a list up here. But then something happened that there's some kind of glitch, and I think there's a problem that many people are not getting in. But please note that our event will be recorded and available on our website later, probably by the end of next week. And by staying on now, you are consenting to being recorded. So you can turn off your camera if you do not wish to be recorded. You don't want your opinion recorded. Okay, I do want to take a moment to reflect on Virginia's land and labor recognition. Okay, so Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tudelano-Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationship with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that the Moral Land Grant Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands and other areas in the West. This is the short version, but our labor recognition also acknowledges that Virginia Tech acknowledges that its Blacksburg campus is partly on land that was previously the site of the Smithfield and Solitude plantations, owned by members of the Preston family. Between 1770s and 1860s, the Prestons and other local white families that owned parcels of what became Virginia Tech also owned hundreds of enslaved people. Enslaved Black people generated resources that financed Virginia Tech's predecessor institution, the Preston and Olin Institute, and they worked on the construction of the building. And we have, you can look this up on, I don't know if you have it there at hand, but I will put it in later, the link on the Inclusive VT page. Okay, some very brief housekeeping notes. We're going to get to the talk right away. It'll be approximately 25 minutes and then approximately 20 minutes for Q&A. So you can put your questions in the chat and we'll keep track of them in a Google Doc. So, or after the presentation, you can also raise your hands and you can unmute yourself and speak. Now, finally, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rebecca Williams, otherwise known as Becky Williams, is assistant professor at Grand Valley State University. She specializes in gender development and explores the evolving landscape of gender within development initiatives. The PhD in interdisciplinary ecology and a graduate certificate in gender and development, she brings a unique interdisciplinary perspective to her research. But I want to say that the reason Becky is here is because I made her acquaintance years ago when she worked with CRED on the Innovate Rural Livelihood Study that examined causes of violence in Honduras and how these affect youth crime, rural livelihoods, migration, among other factors. And then we also worked together on the Gender and Development Conference that we organized, where I gave her the crazy assignment of your role is to make this engaging, even though with COVID it had gone online and I was very concerned that it would not be engaging. So she was critical to the wonderful success of the event with her creative and meticulous planning that made virtual series engaging, interactive, and fun. All kinds of things to do. And that's still online at wdvconf.org. Okay, so having worked extensively, now this is more on Becky, in international settings, including as an environmental educator extensionist with the Peace Corps, Dr. Williams delves into how large-scale agencies like USAID address gender dynamics. Her current project focuses on understanding men's roles in empowerment efforts and the influence of masculinity on development strategies. Through her work, Dr. Williams highlights the importance of recognizing and addressing gender complexities within global development paradigms. All of the details are available. Okay, the title of her talk, the title of the talk is with the capital N, Women's Empowerment. How do large-scale development agencies approach men and masculinities in gender-based project programming and women's empowerment initiatives? So please welcome Dr. Becky Williams. Okay, and go ahead and share your screen.
All right. Okay, can you see my screen okay? Brilliant. All right, thank you so much, Maria Lisa, for having me in Virginia Tech. I was telling Maria Lisa earlier, my niece is actually graduating from Virginia Tech this semester. So I also have that connection to Virginia Tech.
And then I'm
yeah.
seeing notes. You don't have your, that's not what we were seeing
Oh, it's
before.
my notes? Oh, okay. Let's try that again then.
Yeah.
It's giving me like 85,000 options to choose from here.
Yeah.
Let's see. There we go. Does that look better? Okay.
Right.
All right, brilliant. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about one of my research projects. This is really a higher level document analysis that I'm conducting. And so I want to talk a little bit about why I wanted to look into men and masculinities. And so I've been working in the area of development and development practice since 2009 when I joined the Peace Corps. After that, went into my PhD. And so I've been fortunate in the development landscape to have many roles as a volunteer, as a development practitioner, as a researcher, and really research is where my role continues to be now. However, even back when I joined, the Peace Corps, we were trained in, how to look out for men specifically. I was in Honduras, which is still the second most dangerous country in the world outside of active war areas. And I remember even in our service that we were told, like, hey, if you are walking down the road and you see a group of young men, go the other way because, you don't know what they're doing, especially if they're outside of a bar and all this. So we have this pervasive mentality of how we see young men when we're talking about development. But I've lived and worked in Honduras for many years, and then there's this other side of men that we talk less about, and that's, the men who are fathers and, trying to take care of their families that also experience loss. 95% of homicides in Honduras go unsolved. There's high levels of crime, and men are also dealing with these issues on top of some others. And so this I have been found over the years there's just a lack of complexity in looking at men, and we tend to treat men as this large homogenous group. So what is a true view of men? Is it, in Honduras, is it the men who join the gangs or, experience high levels of loss and that we attribute with domestic violence? Or is it men who experience loss themselves or are trying to grow crops and feed their families or take the extremely dangerous trip to the United States to try to enter in as irregular migrants to find labor to send money home? And so what is actually going on with men and how are we looking at them in the international development context? So I was hoping to get into beyond USAID, but for now, the majority of what I've been looking at has been within USAID's context. Why USAID? Because they are one of the major world funders of development assistance. And, all of my funding that I've had and all of my projects, even my research has all been funded by USAID. And so they are the ones that I looked at first, but I have plans to expand this research. So this is preliminary research. So as we all know, if we're attending this particular event, we know what gender is, and a gender according to USAID is looking at roles, responsibilities, rights, entitlements, and obligations, and power relations. But what does gender actually look like in practice, in USAID's practice? And so if you look back on the 2012 USAID policy, they talk about gender a lot. Obviously, in this policy, they really are focusing on women with 168 distinct, mentions of women, girls, female, 342 total, where we see very little talk about men. Being male, boys, or men in general. We only see 92 mentions of that. And then I look later at the 2020 policy, which is not the most recent. There's actually one more recent one that I'll talk about in a minute here. And I wanted to see if there was any difference. And so we see this slight uptick in the way that USAID is talking about men. So we have more mentions of men and boys and being male and fathers, but we still see this just massive disproportionate difference in the way that we're talking about in these gender strategies. We're really, really focusing on women and women's needs, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I'm going to get to what my concerns are about this. So really, this is a natural progression, or I think a natural outcome of the WIDWAG-GAD time periods where we, very first started out with Esther Boserup, saying like, hey, like women, let's get women into the workforce. When we are doing development work, we're really not thinking about women's economic needs and how that can help, with, their bargaining power within the household and all this. Then there was this recognition of, well, there's women have more going on that we haven't thought about. We haven't looked at the reproductive sphere and all the work women are doing there. All the unrecognized work in agriculture, for example, that women do all the time. And then into the more GAD focused, or we need to look at roles and norms and broaden out to the cultural and social aspects of gender and how that influences men and women's differential access to resources and opportunities and so on. And then we eventually moved into this more into an empowerment movement, which is kind of where we are kind of still hovering in this idea of women's empowerment and practical and strategic needs and how do you fit those. And so when the entire field of women, of gender and development really did start with an intentional focus on women because of, the lack of attention on women that has been, historically before that, and the patriarchy, the influences of all that. So it's kind of, it's not terribly surprising that we really are focusing on women, but I do think that there are some consequences to that. And this is one of them. In my work in Honduras, I have done a couple of large projects on gender-based violence, researching it. And this really stuck with me. I went to this battered women's shelter in Honduras and had a lovely conversation with a woman who was the director. And, she was going through all these amazing things that they were doing. They housed women for 3 months. They taught them education skills, school, like how to read, how they taught them about their rights, and took their kids as well and provided them with psychological care. And so really just intentional, very deep care of these women who were victims of gender-based violence for 3 months. And then I asked, okay, well, what happens at the end of the 3 months? And she paused and said, well, they go home. And I said, well, are you doing any work with the men? And she said, no, nobody funds work with men on violence. And I was like, really? And she's like, no, there is no money to work with the men. And she told me, she said, sometimes I feel like we're actually doing a disservice. We're actually making things worse because we teach women all of these things that they need to know to really thrive and know their rights. And then we're sending them right back home into the same situation that they left without ever addressing what's going on with men. And that really stuck with me. And it's also something that I have observed in many different country contexts that I work in. I'm focusing this presentation on Honduras and in Latin America, but I've also worked in the African continent, in both the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Southeast Asia. And I kind of see this theme coming up over and over again. And so when we look at masculinity specifically, the USAID gender policies really don't talk about masculinity, just very little. And we actually saw a decrease in that between 2012 and 2020. Now, there is a new 2023 policy that now has this like call out where they talk about boys, men, and masculinities. And this is the first time I have really seen an intentional effort in USAID's policy level documentation on how they address the needs of unique needs of men and boys. So this is actually very encouraging. However, when I went through that document with a very detailed focus, I did not see any real difference between that one and the 2020 policy, other than the box that acknowledges that this is something that we need to be looking in. So this really made me want to know, like, what is going on with men and masculinity in the development sphere? How does, the lack of focus of masculinities, how does that affect women's empowerment efforts? And then, what does that have to do with, what we're trying to do in empowering women in their practical and strategic needs, if we're not doing the same kind of work with their male counterparts? And so right now I've looked at all of USAID's country development cooperation strategies, which they do in collaboration with their country partners, as well as their regional documents. So I looked at 61 documents and conducted a thematic analysis. This is very preliminary and there are some limitations. Obviously, these are policy level documents, and I chose policy level documents because the funding follows the policy. However, I have plans in the future to go much deeper into other USAID documentation, like national level work plans, and to get a deeper dive into how the different people who are receiving USAID funding are utilizing it. I also would like to increase this into other large-scale agencies, not just USAID, but look at kind of the broader spectrum of the top donors and how they are looking at gender. So out of the series of where the 61 different countries that had country development cooperation strategies, when you look at how they are talking about men, or if they're talking about men in their gender strategies, it immediately drops from 61 to 31. So immediately half of the gender strategies are not addressing men or masculinities as part of their gender strategy at all. So within these 31, we have the different development objectives. So the large scale thematic areas that USAID works in. So in the education sphere, we only have discussion of men and masculinities in 12 countries. In health, only 11. In economic growth, 6. In governance, 5. In security, 4. And in agriculture, 2. And that's really interesting. So when you actually look at the language that they're using here, too, I think that this says a lot about how we are looking at this particular topic. So across these different development objectives, when we look at health, we have 5 countries that basically are referring, when they're talking in the text, are referring to both men and women. And so what I mean here is, like, for example, giving equal opportunities to flourish and become productive citizens. So we're really talking about just like addressing both men and women in these initiatives. Similarly, we see a very similar thing in education, where there's 8 countries that refer to both men and women, and they're really talking about equitable education outcomes for boys and girls. There's been more of a focus on boys, as boys have been seen to, in some places, especially Latin America and the Caribbean, that are going to school less and less often. So we see, a bit of a focus on trying to get boys back in school, but again, we're just talking about boys and girls, right? Similarly, in governance, talking about champions for gender equality, looking at this language of both men and women. In economic growth, focusing on the jobs that women and men want. In agriculture, talking about reducing barriers to credit for men and women. And in security, this one is one of the more interesting ones in Jamaica, looking at how males and females are pulled into acts of violence, which is one of the few places that we see this focus on gender and acts of violence rather than being victims of violence. When I looked at the language around engaging men as gatekeepers to women's empowerment, which it kind of goes back to the discussions around power through. Of course, there are some complexities to power through in the conceptualization of that. However, one interesting aspect of power through is the idea of gatekeepers as part of women's empowerment. So interestingly, we only see this in 2 domains, in health and in governance, and it's really largely focused in the continent of Africa, and specifically on health. And you can see that this has a lot to do with engaging men and boys as family planners. And this came out of a lot of challenges in the health field and getting family planning as being a kind of a normative part of culture, when men feel like that's a responsibility of women and they don't necessarily take responsibility for family planning. So there's been a real push on family planning and trying to get men involved in their responsibilities there. And that's really what we see throughout the engaging men as gatekeepers in health. And we have here, this is actually one of the only times they use the language gatekeepers to ensure that both men and women can adopt healthier behaviors. Similarly, when it comes to governance, we have engaging men and boys as allies in terms of gender-based violence. So it's interesting that these are kind of the health is really the focus of bringing in men and masculinities. And then in South Africa regionally, there's a little bit of a focus here on engaging men in terms of reducing gender-based violence. What about looking at masculinity specifically, or how men really define themselves as men, how they see the roles and the norms of being a man in society? There's only 5 countries that address masculinity in their gender strategy. And those oftentimes have to do with getting men and boys into education, especially those that are at risk. We see trying to reduce the lure of crime or negative influence. In governance, there is also a focus on trying to understand how men and boys get pulled into conflicts. And so we see that that their strategy is to take a better gender lens and understanding external conflicts. And then in economic growth, we see a little bit of activity in Honduras with men serving as gatekeepers to women's participation in the economy. So some talk about, and this is the only nation, the only national strategy that I have seen that focuses specifically on new forms of gender equitable and nonviolent masculinity. So really addressing masculinity itself as part of gender programming. You don't really see that in any other of the country strategies. So recognizing that men and their roles and responsibilities, there are some specific needs of men. There's only 5 countries that look into that. So we see, again, this focus on trying to keep boys in school. We have trying to get young men into the workforce, and this kind of ties back to this vilification of young men that we've been seeing. I've seen this a lot in Latin America and the Caribbean specifically, other places as well. And then again into security, and in Jamaica and Tunisia, where there's a lot of unrest in terms of trying to avoid, men being pulled into, extremism and other types of violent acts. And in terms of addressing men's roles in specifically for the promotion of women's empowerment, we only see that in the health sphere. And that really is reducing the perception that advancements by women equate to a loss of power for men. And again, this is one of the only places where I see this recognition that that men and masculinities and their roles has an influence on how women's empowerment initiatives are received. And this is another really important one in terms of focusing on men and boys to equalize power around health outcomes. So I kind of blazed through this because we kind of started a little bit late, and I wanted to have a good amount of time to kind of talk about your thoughts and things on this. So there's some preliminary things that I wanted to bring up. As I looked through these documents and have started looking into other national level internal documents, USAID, everything is posted, so you can download all the countries' different documents and stuff. As I've been going through, we see that gender is still largely synonymous with women. Throughout the vast majority of what I've seen, when we're talking about gender, it is focused specifically on women and women's needs. We see very little of men's involvements as gatekeepers. And when we do, it's almost always related to health and sexual and reproductive outcomes. We rarely see masculinities or men as gatekeepers being addressed in other domains of development. It's rarely involved as a key factor in sustainable development and women's empowerment. And men and boys' unique needs are really only focused in the education sphere and trying to get men and boys back into the school system, and especially at the secondary and tertiary levels. So there were some slight changes in the 2023 policy that, makes me think that maybe the winds are shifting slightly towards looking more at men and masculinities and their role. However, there is still a lot lacking in terms of the recognition of the need to work with men on masculinities and specifically around gender-based violence. Back to the very beginning quote that nobody funds work with men on violence. There's some recognition of the role of men and boys and how masculinities is a pull or a push factor into illicit livelihoods. But I know, I work a lot in Honduras, and we really are trying to combat the lure of gang and narco trafficking activity as an alternative economic strategy, especially for young boys, where they don't see that they have a lot of options in the workforce. And, I work largely in rural Honduras. And, the mentality is, there's no point in going to school because I can't get a job. There's nothing to do around here. The crops are failing. There's with the effects of climate change, there's a lot of unrest, a lot of political instability. And so they see their choices as maintain the status quo and continue to try to do what I'm doing, migrate to the United States and hope that you can get in across the border and get a good job, or get involved with the gangs and narco traffickers. And I have seen this myself many times in things like communities where the gangs or the narco traffickers really are the ones providing security and food. In one place, the narco traffickers were building a new school for the community. In another town, they were building a new Catholic church for the community. And so again, this lack of recognition of how men perceive themselves and their role in society, how they identify as men, how that then influences what they see as their options. And then again, a very little recognition of the role of masculinities in the gender transformation of women. However, there are some really important questions that come out of this as well. So for me, I've been thinking a lot about, what does it mean that we're in gender and development, but we're not necessarily looking at how, how men are involved here? What are the consequences of that? When is it important to involve men as gatekeepers? And this is a conversation that I've had with a lot of people who work in gender and development, where the mentality and that many of us have is like, well, over time, it has been men who have been the recipients of development aid largely. And then, what we're trying to do and is kind of right the ship when we're talking about gender and development. And that's why we oftentimes will focus on women. And there is a big push against trying to bring men into that conversation because there is a concern that will take away from the focus on what women really need. And I think that's an important conversation to have. However, I would also argue that not bringing this conversation at a wider and a larger scale, are we sustainably, is this development sustainability? Is this, are we actually moving towards more equity for women? And then also, how are we addressing men and masculinity across thematic areas? Should women's empowerment initiatives always include a component of working with men? And how do we, and this last one is probably the most important, how do we address men and masculinity without taking the focus and funding away from important women's initiatives? So I would also really seriously do not want to see money taken away from really important work being done with women without really thinking through, the implications of that. So I saw immediately the question about the CDCSs and the RDCSs. And so yeah, I have actually started digging in and I've been using Honduras as the case study, but I have started digging into the different reports and budgets and things along those lines to see how the budgetary allocation and how the different projects that are passed through money specifically are addressing gender differently. And so, for example, like the consortium models or money that goes to the universities and then the projects come out of those pots of money, they do look slightly different in terms of depending on who is on that project, what their background in gender and development is, and if they are taking masculinity into consideration. However, at least in what I've looked at so far, and I still have a lot of digging to do, it's still very, very dominant that it's really focused specifically on women with very little focus on men and masculinities, except for in health and education, which are the two areas that I see that coming out a little bit more. So, so I think that the interesting thing to think about there is, where does policy lead? How does the language in the policy affect the financial, the budgetary, and so on? And there was, I myself worked on an AID project where we couldn't, the way that our funding was framed, we couldn't branch out into this other area because we were locked in to, the M&E plan and the way that it had been structured in the call for proposals. So, so I kind of wanted to open this up for some thoughts on the role of men and masculinities in gender and developments, and like what exactly, if you think that there is a space for that, or if it takes away from other important conversations. So I went really fast because I was concerned about time when we started a little bit late, and Lisa maybe also was like, don't go too long. So I would love to open it up to some questions. Conversation.
Thank you very much. And actually you did perfect.
Yeah, all right, great.
And we have a small group, so I'm hoping we can get a good conversation going. Now it looks like we have another question. Dee, did you feel like she addressed your question? I'm gonna go on to the next question here from Manami. Would you like to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. This was a really great talk and I learned a lot. And I know a little, or it's not my field, but just from what I've read, I'm in the field of science and technology studies and development intersections, and I'm an assistant professor here. So thank you for this talk. And, I was really familiar with the girl effect, especially in relation to energy development and renewable energy, and that sort of this neoliberal push to, if you just give a girl energy or education, she's going to just change the world. We're not going to focus on politics. We're going to focus on the sort of, hopeful grassroots transformation. And at the same time, from my understanding, men are stereotyped to be like incipiently violent or terrorists or drunkards or alcoholics or whatever. Like they're just not worth putting our efforts into. And I was wondering if there was sort of this racialized component to it. If you're familiar with, and I don't know if you can answer this, about equivalent attention paid to masculinity as gatekeepers in various fields in the global north. Like with domestic violence, which is also an issue up here too, and whether this lack of attention for men is somehow asymmetric, with relationship to what's going on in the so-called global Northwestern countries.
Yeah, what a great question. So I'll comment on a couple of things. I think that that girl effect phenomenon is really interesting. But when you take a step back and look at that, and I see this all the time in Honduras, where women are able to move the bar in a lot of senses when their partner is in the United States, or especially when there's migration involved, right? Where women are by themselves. And there are whole communities in Honduras, for example, where it is predominantly women because the men have all migrated, right? And in some sense, that does, I think the research is clear that it does move the bar for women. However, they're having to do that on top of all of their other normative responsibilities. And so, I wonder, one of the other things that really bothers me in the development field, and it's a different presentation, but one thing I think we need to be looking at a lot more, and it's kind of related, is mental health, right? And the mental health of the people that we are working with, as well as the mental health of development practitioners, is not a conversation that we ever have, in my experience in development. So kind of like going along with that, it's kind of a catch-22 a little bit in terms of the girl effect. And what I see is that when men then come home is when you start getting this backlash effect of men reasserting their power, reasserting their role as the head of the household, and then that can result in backlash in terms of domestic violence, of women losing, the income sources that they may have gotten while men were gone. And so, to me, that we're still talking about, in the girl effect, we're still talking about a lack of focus on shifting men's mentalities, which really worries me. And I do think that you, in your comment here about men in the global South are stereotyped as terrorists, drunkards, and inherently violent. I mean, I really do see that. And I also hear all of the discourses, and I've seen it myself, the mentality of like, well, now that the wife is making an income, the husband just stops doing anything. And then, you have the woman who's doing all the household responsibilities and the economic, and in some senses are almost disempowered by the empowerment process, because now they're having to do everything, and their husband just like throws up their hands and checks out. And so to me, that is another signal that we're not addressing the other side of that equation in terms of shifting the way men see their roles. And I do think that there is a corollary with the global North. I mean, I think in the global North, we have more of an awareness. And I think depending upon your community and culture in the global North, I grew up in a household that was very gendered, but, my niece's household was not at all. And so I've seen some shifts in terms of that, especially with the younger generation. However, I do still think that we don't treat the phenomenon of domestic violence as a two-sided issue. And I don't mean two-sided in any way in terms of like blame on women. I mean that that the perpetrator is not being addressed in this larger discourse. I mean, basically, we really focus in gender-based violence on getting women out of bad situations, which is extremely important and should still very much be our priority. But then how do we shift the overall situation if the men are never held accountable or brought into, programs that can address, how their masculinity is displaying in terms of violence and alcoholism and things like that. Does that answer your question? And I do also think it's very racialized. I do think that this is an intersectional issue as well as just a gender issue. And I think that it is also an intersectional issue in the global South, which I personally don't think that intersectionality has really gotten into development work just yet. But I see, Maria Lisa really liked a picture that I had in my presentation. It's on the flyer of the man with the little boy. Well, that is an indigenous community in Honduras where men are very involved with their children. But you go to the Mestizo area right down the road, and you would never see a guy, hanging out with his son in that same way. So, and that is intersectionality, right? That is like the indigenous male versus in this area versus, and so I do also think that one thing we need to really be thinking about in gender development is not putting men in a category that's just men. Right, because we also have stratification within that group, and we have champions within that group, but we're not talking about it using that kind of language.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mary had her hand up. Mary, would you like to unmute? Great.
Yes, good morning. I am Mary. I'm an international student from Nigeria. I don't know if you remember me, Dr. Maria Lisa. I once sent you a message. I'm with Professor Loiban Crowder. So I have a contribution and also a question. Using my experience as a woman from Nigeria, if you are using men as a gatekeepers to any empowerment program towards women, I don't think, I'm talking from my experience now, because men in Nigeria are against equality of women with them. Do you understand? They always want to dominate. They always want to be in charge. So if they are in charge of any program towards the empowerment of women, I don't think such program will be effective or successful in any way. Because women, like women in Nigeria, we are in charge, we dominate the agricultural sector, but we are not recognized because they believe that our roles is part of our roles to be a woman to take care of the family. Despite that, our roles is bringing in money, but it's not recognized anyway. So in any way they are put in charge, any program relating to women, they will make sure that they benefit from it more than women. So use them as gatekeeper, to me, I don't think is the right way. And to my question, presently I'm taking feminist theory as a course. And I believe that feminism help us to look at situation using gender lens. Feminism preach empathy, not sympathy. We see things like to help people in general. We believe that we are first human being before we are male or female or any other gender. So I have this question about gender-based violence. Gender-based violence to women have been the most pronounced. But in Nigeria, there are some men too that are faced with gender violence. How can this be addressed? Because men cannot come out and say they've been beaten by their wives. No.
Yeah.
So I was wondering that how can this be addressed? How can we make men to come out and tell us their problem, what they are facing? They have this ego that I'm the head of the family. How can I talk and say my wife is beating me? Or do you understand? So,
yeah. What a great question. So, so one clarification I want to make is I do not think that men should be gatekeepers for women's empowerment. My concern is that men believe that they are, like you were saying, like men, they don't want women to go through, go through these empowerment processes. Like they want women to stay within their roles and responsibilities. And so from that perspective, I'm saying that men are behaving as gatekeepers. And that's where we get some situations where, women really struggle to get past that role of men and that thought process of men as gatekeepers. So what I'm saying is that when we have women's empowerment initiatives, we also have to work towards changing the viewpoints of men on women in terms of like their view that women should stay in the home and should do X, Y, and Z. But what I largely see is that we work with the women themselves. We work very hard and intentionally with the women without ever talking to the men. And that's something that I have been concerned about and in the communities that I work in, it has resulted in a lot of backlash. Whereas there are also some communities that I'm familiar with and some things that I've read where when the development agency intentionally works with men on masculinities and the way they view themselves and the way that they view their role within the household and within the community, and I've seen this, there's a lot of work on nutrition in agriculture, specifically on this topic as well, that you see a different kind of shift within the household than a man being very resistant to a woman entering the workforce or controlling her own money, or whatever that case may be. So, so I really think it's like, to me, I've just been seeing like over and over, and in the literature as well, this by only focusing on women, that we're not moving how men see their entire roles within society, and so we're kind of just fighting back in a way that I don't know is always being productive. In terms of the domestic violence where men are victims of domestic violence, yeah, that's a big conversation that we're not having really not having in a lot of spheres. And it's an issue in the United States and the global North as well. So that is very, very tied to masculinity. And if a man says like they're being verbally or physically abused by a woman, then there is this, it is really a taboo to actually come out and talk about that. So we have that issue in the global North as well as in the global South. And in terms of what to do about that, I mean, I still think that that thinking about, you know, how we see one another, I think you mentioned as humans first before, you know, we look at gender.
Yes.
Yeah. That's kind of the same mentality is how do we have conversations where we are shifting what we consider to be manly and what we consider to be feminine, for example, so that a man who is experiencing an abuse can, you know, can speak out and can get assistance without being, you know, othered, really.
Yes.
So I don't have a great answer to the question because it is a really big issue, not, you know, worldwide, that we haven't really been seriously talking about on a large scale.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I saw Valerie's hand, I think, is up next.
Great. Wasn't sure how to unmute myself. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
So no, I just wanted to kind of maybe follow up with what Deborah was mentioning in the chat. I think it might be really helpful to maybe do some KIIs with some of the development organizations. Because even though it's not, I guess, as explicit in the higher level documents, and I should probably introduce myself. I'm a senior technical advisor for nutrition sensitive and gender sensitive agriculture from Catholic Relief Services. So and I've been with them for about 12 years now. And I would say that if you did like KIIs with some of our implementing organizations, you would probably end up seeing and hearing a lot more. Not as much as definitely. There's definitely a lot more on women interventions, but like CRS, we do a lot around couples and couples communication, and then that's bringing them together to talk about rights, and then talk about communication skills, decision-making aspects, but together as a couple versus one or the other.
Yeah, which is a very interesting way to approach that. Yeah.
And we have two different approaches for that. And then we also have a peaceful masculinity course that we've been working with in some of our programs. And I know like World Vision has been doing masculinity work for a long time, and other organizations. So I think if you want to, and a lot of this is funded by USAID, but some of it's not. So it would be interesting to kind of like delve deeper into those, because we might be, as implementers, even though it's not so explicit in their high level documents, we seem to be doing some of it here even also.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you're from Catholic Relief Services, because the two organizations that I've been looking into that do the most work around men and masculinities is Catholic Relief Services and CARE International, who both have taken very intentional, larger scale approaches to men and masculinities that I've not necessarily seen reflected in some of the other state-funded development agencies. So I did do 28 key informant interviews in Honduras specifically, with organizations, and largely in the western part of Honduras, but in 5 different municipalities. And I saw the exact same thing. Now, with the exception of Catholic Relief Services and CARE International, a little bit of work by World Vision. But I did 28 key informant interviews in Honduras specifically, and that's the country that I plan on going into a very deep dive where I'm looking at budgets as well as work plans for all of the different projects within the country, so that I can really dig into like what you're saying with the difference between what happens at the policy level, and then once the funding gets allocated, how that shifts as you get down towards the other levels. One of the reasons why this made me so interested is because I've received so much pushback from development agencies, including USAID, in trying to do any purposeful integration of men and masculinities on a project level or on, you know, on a larger project scale. I've experienced a lot of pushback against that. So within the Honduran context, and my colleagues and I are working on a publication on this. I did this with the ATEA, if anybody knows ATEA in Honduras. But you know, when I went around and we started talking about specifically looking at men and masculinities in terms of gender-based violence, there was none of the organizations were working with men, with the exception of Catholic Relief Services and CRS. But even in Honduras, they weren't doing very much with men. They were really focusing on women. So I agree with you, Valerie.
Yeah.
And that is my plan, is as I continue with this research, is to expand the different organizations that I'm looking at, as well as going into a deeper dive into what they're doing on the ground level.
Yeah, and maybe part of it is also focusing on Latin America, because the funding
Mhm.
mechanisms for Latin America are very limited and different than kind of the Africa. And so there's a lot less like development organizations can do around gender in Latin America, just because of the limited amount of funding that goes there. So
Yeah, and some of the presidential transitions too really affects, you know, what, you know, when Trump was in the administration versus when Biden's in the administration and Obama's in the administration. You also get the Mexico City protocols and things like that that really change, you know, what you're able to do in the field. And I think that is not something I've integrated into my research, but would be interesting to do, is to look and see how that shifts over the different political changes that we have. And that's USAID specific, obviously. But I think that would be interesting to look at too. And yes, CRS in terms of working with men in gangs, you know, and I haven't looked a lot. I should specify that I primarily work in rural communities. So my own research, when I'm looking at the approaches to gender-based violence, have largely been in the peri-urban and rural areas of Honduras, not like Tegucigalpa or San Pedro Sula. They're really big cities. However, I did work with some, you know, youth houses and things like that were telling me some very similar things, except that there is some funding to work with gangs. I think that's a very challenging area to work in, but that is one area where they are, I think, working on masculinities, but not in terms of masculinities as we're looking at gender and women's empowerment. It really has to do with like getting men out of gangs. Yeah. Jacqueline, I think I saw your hand.
And we've only got like 5 minutes.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll be quick.
What have you said? Limited time?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes, but I'll make my responses briefer.
Okay. Thank you very much, Becky, for your presentations. I'm so sorry. I just came towards the tail end, but I could grasp what you have just presented. I'm very proud of you. You're doing very good work, because this is the approach to gender that we are looking for. I keep telling people that there's no way we can ensure women's empowerment without involving men, because on this planet we live more men and women. We are not living in a vacuum. So you're doing a very good job. And maybe to add on to what the others have said, someone said they do couple.
Men and women
Yes.
together, yeah.
Yes, then role plays can be very good. Role plays can be very good. And getting gender champions in the community to give those who are doing good work, those can encourage other people to do that. Then in terms of male, what is it, who are facing domestic violence. Yeah, people are there suffering a lot, but we also encourage to create male forums.
Yeah, places where men can talk about masculinity.
Yes, they can talk freely about that. And your approach is excellent, because people are getting tackling this gender issue in a very wrong way, to the point that when you even look at publications, someone is talking about gender, but you look at entire publication, they are just talking about women. You know, you have to compare the two. to find out where the issues are. And then lastly, women's empowerment, it is intrinsic. It is intrinsic. We have to deal with things like self-esteem, self-confidence, your ability to relate with others. You have a network, you know, you can make a decision and act on it. But people are misinterpreting like it is about these extrinsic factors. Yes, those ones can help you get from one point to the next point, but you need to work on the inner self.
Mhm.
That's how I understand women empowerment. And unless we do that, there is no women empowerment. And unless we also sensitize the men, they need to be sensitized. Because I've been in sensitization meetings where you tell the men these are the issues and they understand. It is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, and where I have seen like really substantial changes within specific communities, it has been women and men working together, and it's sometimes men actually shifting the way that they see their wife and the way that they see their role, and that becomes a model for other people in the community. So again, that idea of sensitization. So I certainly, you know, just to make one broad statement, you know, there are people working in this area, obviously, as some people have mentioned, like dig into kind of some of like the deeper stuff. And I do think that that's really important. I plan to go much deeper into seeing what's going on. But I also do have concerns that we're not talking about this in the field enough, in terms of how these things are related and, you know, our approaches to men and women and how, you know, how that plays out on the broader scale. And I kind of think that a lot of the things that we are seeing are some of the outcomes of not trying to shift how men see themselves and their roles, as well as where we're trying to empower women internally and through economics and through, you know, social mobility and so on and so forth. So, so I do have a lot more research to do, and I'm hoping, you know, eventually I'll be able to put out something that is really a lot more complex than what I presented today. But I also think that policy drives funding, and, you know, where our funding can, like my very first quote, nobody funds work with men on violence, is, you know, one of the indicators of that. Dee, I saw that you had your hand, and I know we only have 2 minutes left, but if I can answer it quickly, I'm happy to. And while Dee's on meeting, I'm going to shout out to my niece, Elena, who's graduating from Virginia Tech, since she's on the line. So it's like shout out to Virginia Tech, a Husky graduating in April.
So
Dee,
I don't need an
sorry.
answer, Becky. I just
Yeah.
think it would be really helpful to deepen the analysis
Yeah.
that you've provided by looking at more of a historical view. You mentioned changes based on administration, and that's one piece. But also, I think that there was an enormous amount of work when we were putting literally billions of dollars into HIV prevention that looked at masculinities and men's involvement in different ways, and that trying to understand some of these trends over time in different sectors, I think would really make a difference and provide a more nuanced analysis. So
yeah, I completely agree, and I appreciate that. So before I try to actually publish a paper, I'm going to go much deeper on this. And I will say that I think that the legacy of that, what you're talking about in the health field, is why we see all of the action around masculinities really in the health field is a legacy of the HIV and AIDS mobilization, and like you said, like how that has shifted over time with the different administrations and so on. So yeah, I think that taking in that historical aspect would also deepen, as well as going down into the documents themselves. So that's my honestly, that's what I'm going to be doing over the summer.
sounds good.
All right, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating. It is 1:30, and I can say that we'll have a great lineup next year. We already are talking to several people, and if you have any recommendations for speakers, you can email me that as well. Thank you so much, Becky, for your presentation, and you've always done great work, and good luck in finding time between teaching and everything in your new job there to do lots of great research to contribute to this very important topic.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for engaging in the discussion, because it is a very controversial discussion, and so I really appreciate everybody taking the time to share their thoughts and all that.
All right, thank you. All right.